I've seen some compelling information on the internet that states that carbohydrates are really bad for us. In my pursuit for better health, personally, but generally looking at what people are going through and struggling with, I discovered a very interesting article on the internet with a title of Carbohydrates and the Carnivore Diet. And that hooked me in because I'm intrigued by the carnivore diet, although I'm not strictly doing it 100% because I feel it's not necessarily what I need, although I have done the reset, and that is certainly a useful thing to do. But what's got me interested here is this information from this dentist in the US called Dr. Kevin Stock. And he's written a very interesting, and it's a bit long, but it is very much worth reading because he covers what carbohydrates are all the way through to the components and what we typically eat in these forms, and then the history of how we got to this point of consuming so much sugar and what it potentially does to us. So it's quite a bold statement to say that carbohydrates are bad for us because essentially most of the world eat an incredible amount of carbohydrates, and there isn't much else on the internet that supports this claim. There aren't many other notable institutions or doctors saying the same thing. There's certainly a lot of people, proponents for the carnivore diet. So is this something in its infancy? Are we going to see people jumping in and doing proper research and realizing that this is true or not? I don't know. But my gut feeling is there's a lot to believe in what I've read in this article. So I want to go over a little bit of this and you guys can see what you think. And I would encourage you, look in the description for the article if you want an in-depth read. But essentially, what are carbohydrates? Carbohydrates are sugars and in the body are broken down to glucose or fructose or a combination of the two. The carbohydrate sugars essentially provide energy for the body. Glucose in the bloodstream might go directly to the cells for immediate energy. Sugar is stored in the liver and muscles as glycogen in a short-term capacity. Long-term storage goes to fat. Essentially, most carbohydrates come from plants. So essentially what Dr. Kevin Stock is saying is that, and he does have another article, and this may be another video, where he does talk about plants being bad for us. And that's quite a bold statement as well. But here, let's just stick with the carbohydrates and the massive amount of sugar that essentially humans eat. As an example, he uses potatoes. They're broken down in the body. Amylose becomes glucose. The second form of the carb sugars is table sugar, also known as sucrose. And generally when people say sugar, they are referring to that white stuff that you might heap into your coffee. Sucrose is essentially a molecule of fructose and glucose. Typical source is sugarcane. There is also sugar beet, but typically sugarcane. The third source of sugars is from fruit and comes in the form of fructose. This fructose goes straight to the liver and is stored as glycogen. Just as a side note, in case any of you scientists out there pick up on this, there is another form of sugar, and that's lactose. But the milk sugar, we won't go into here. So what's the point of discussing all of this? Carbohydrates, carbs, is something that people talk a lot about. Talk about low-carb diets, and carbs essentially make up a lot of what you see in the supermarket or in cafes and restaurants. And essentially carbs are sugars. Normally, I think when you say to someone sugar, they think of the white stuff you heap into your tea or coffee, or they think of desserts and chocolates and candies. But you've got to realize that a lot of the fruit and vegetables are basically sugars. The reason we talk about this is there's a lot of detrimental damage, essentially, that this amount of sugar is doing to our bodies and our society. Humans have essentially been low or no carb eaters for most of their existence. It's only in if you put it out on a timeline, within the last 10,000 years, that scientists think that we've turned to agriculture and carbs have begun to be part of our diet. But we've existed for so much longer than that. So it's in the scope of human existence, it's a relatively new thing that we've taken to carbs. And what's more significant about that is when we look at the agricultural revolutions, how they have perpetuated the intake, the uptake of carbohydrates and sugars. So it's been very much an influence of man's ingenuity or perceived ingenuity, because it could be argued that it's massively flawed. 10,000 years ago, there was a Neolithic revolution when the first signs of agriculture were formed in terms of settlements becoming large and people coming together and essentially settling and no longer being nomadic. These first settlements turned to practicing agriculture to support the greater populations. Then in the 17th century in Britain, there was a second agricultural revolution, and this was an unprecedented increase in agricultural production. Then in the 1930s to the 1960s, we have the third agricultural revolution, also called the Green Revolution, and a scientist called Norman Borlaug in the US of Norwegian descent is said to, he's credited with saving 1 billion lives in what he did with pioneering work with agriculture and developing better crops to feed the world. Now, this is very contentious because ultimately, in my view, you could liken it to a brand new ship. Let's say the Titanic at the dock, and it's got a capacity for, let's say, I don't know what the Titanic had, but let's say 700 passengers. But there's a decision to let 4 times as many people on and let's set sail. I'm a firm believer that the world needs balance, and in the wild, it balances itself in terms of predators and prey and plants. Plants provide protection against certain animals, and those animals also are maintained by predators. In the same way, humans many years ago also were maintained essentially. We were preyed upon by larger toothed animals, and there were other mechanisms to keep our population down. In today's world, we are tricking nature, we're beating nature, and our populations have exploded. So is developing a super crop to feed the world and stop millions of people dying ultimately a good thing in terms of the planet? Well, no, you can't argue against that. The argument it comes down to, whether it's just human arrogance or from a religious sensibility or self-preservation. It's simply human life is sacred and we should perpetuate and get stronger and more. It's a big debate and it's highly, highly controversial. Already what I've said will upset a lot of people. But what I'm looking at here is the idea of nature in balance and self-sustaining, a planet that works well together. But we're out of balance, and it's obvious and evident that humans are chronically ill. Obesity, diseases, cancers, and the animal kingdom doesn't suffer this. And it really points to our diet. So I think, Dr. Kevin Stock is onto something in looking at what the causes might be. Whether he's right or 100% right, I'm not too sure. It's still up for discussion. Essentially, we have a physiology and biochemistry based on a low-carb diet. But we are now, particularly since that third revolution, having anything but a low-carb diet. The stats show that we eat about 60% of carbohydrates, and proteins and fats have gone way down in their intake. Essentially, that third agricultural revolution created a commercial industry around food that was, first of all, was unprecedented, but it was focused on more and profits, growth, and essentially health being healthy never featured in any of that. And a quote here from Dr. Kevin Stock, which I think is quite clever, is, "Cows eat grass, gorillas eat leaves, lions eat antelope, and humans eat carbs." Now that certainly wouldn't have been true 20,000 years ago. But today, that's the reality. Now we've got diets where people are beginning to rebalance, but it's in a minority that people are doing the keto diet or the carnivore diet. It's very much true, particularly when you look at the Western world, that carbohydrates dominate our diets. And when you look at the Western world, particularly over Asia, it's beginning to change in Asia, but you look at the Western world and the problems nutritionally and health-wise that are seen, it's ridiculous. The rates of obesity and the various illnesses that are going on that simply weren't there in the 18th century, for example. And following from that quote from Dr. Kevin Stock, humans are the only chronically sick animal. Wildlife isn't obese, doesn't suffer with diabetes, doesn't have osteoporosis, arthritis, allergies, IBS, autoimmune diseases, heart diseases, or cancer. Now the caveat here is animals that we, humans, have domesticated. So cats and dogs, and even agricultural farm animals, we inflict a diet upon them, particularly when you look at domesticated animals in the home. You do see obesity and cancers in cats and dogs. So for me, that's kind of the key. That's the proof that we're screwing things up. When you look at the animal kingdom, the wild animal kingdom, that they don't have these issues. They're not eating all of these sugars, these carbohydrates. So for me, it's pretty obvious. So I think from that point, Dr. Kevin Stock is onto something. Now, whether we exclude all carbs from our diet remains to be seen, and that's something we'll discuss in further videos. So our spiraling health in the 1900s to the present can only have been triggered from that third industrial revolution and the commercialization of food, of the food industry, and the processed aspect of food and manufactured food with additives and chemicals. It's simply not instinctively natural, and it can't be good. And for me, it's pretty obvious. Let me know what you think. Comments below would be really great to see. Or do you enjoy your plastic food and wrapped up packaged treats so much that you simply don't care? Let me know. We will discuss the rest of Dr. Kevin Stock's article in the next video.